Hello, POSC 100 class. Welcome to the video lecture for Module 12, focusing on the presidency. This is in Chapter 13 of your textbook. So there will probably be a couple of videos for this chapter because it is relatively dense. And there's also a video link in this outline that you will need to watch because there will be some quiz questions asked about the video. So starting off, thinking about the powers that the president has, they are outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. So it's always a good idea to understand where these powers that we're going to talk about come from. So first and foremost, the qualifications that any individual needs to meet, pretty basic. In order to become president, you have to be minimum 35 years old, a natural-born American citizen, and you have to be a resident in the U.S. for at least 14 years, which means you could be minimum of 35 years old and have been born in the United States, but if you left the United States for several years, you would have to come back, or if you lived outside of the United States for any length of time, you would have to have been back for at least 14 years in order to be qualified. So that's important to note. Now, as far as terms of office go, these should be pretty familiar to you. Presidents get 4 years per term, and they get a maximum of 2 terms. And it's also interesting to note that the term limit custom was established by George Washington, but it was only after Franklin Delano Roosevelt won an election to 4 terms. So he got 4 terms as president because it was just a custom, but it wasn't required that he limit himself to 2 terms. After that, the Republicans led a charge to draft a constitutional amendment. And so the 22nd Amendment is what actually creates the constitutional requirement for 2 terms. Now, in the same context, thinking of term limits, one term that may be used often or that you may hear used is for a president to be considered a lame duck president. And what that means is it's related to the length of time that they've been in office. So what it means is that, as you know, a president can have a maximum of 2 terms, but the American public knows who the next president is coming in before the current president actually leaves office. So for example, President Obama didn't actually leave office until January of 2016, but we all knew who had won the presidency in November of 2015. So there's that gap wherein we knew that Obama was president, but we also knew that a new president was coming in. So during that time period, President Obama was considered a lame duck president because he was going out of office. So the president's political power is diminished because everyone knows, even though you're still president, you're not going to be for long. So that's why they are sometimes called a lame duck. It's during the end of their term in office. However, whether they got 1 term or 2 terms, we all know when their term is out, we know who's coming in and our attention kind of shifts to that new person. The process of impeachment and removal is very detailed for a reason. It's very strict. There are requirements that have to be met because it is a big deal to remove the president from office. So first, the formal definition of impeachment is a process. It's important to note that impeachment is the process. It's not just the accusation, or it's not just that final act of putting a president or a judge out of office. It's a process in which either an executive or a judicial official, they have to be formally accused of an offense that warrants removal from office. So the impeachment process is what we're going to talk about. Now, first, though, understand that there are some key constitutional reasons why a president might be impeached. So as far as the language in the Constitution, that's where the phrase treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors comes from. So high crimes and misdemeanors is relatively, it can be vague, or there can be different actions that fall within that category, but that's why we have to have the articles of impeachment drawn up so that the Congress can specifically accuse the president of what those, they have to identify what those high crimes and misdemeanors are in the articles of impeachment. Moving on, we have 2 broad grounds, 2 broad reasons why a president might be impeached, and they fall at opposite ends of the spectrum. So on the one end, you could talk about, or you could focus on what we might see as an abuse of power in office. And maybe the American public, and specifically Congress, because they have to draw up these articles, they may feel that the president is on their way to becoming a tyrant. They are abusing their power. They are overreaching or overstepping. At the other end of the spectrum is a failure to carry out their duties in office. So the president is not acting in the way that the president is supposed to act, not doing enough, not kind of carrying out their duties. So either they're overreaching, threatening to become a tyrant, abusing their power, or they're not doing enough. They're failing to carry out the duties that are assigned to them, that are expected of them. So within those two broad grounds, as I said, there's a process that has to take place. So the process of impeachment, it begins in the House of Representatives. That's important to note. And in the House, that is where our representatives actually identify what those high crimes and misdemeanors are and draw up the articles of impeachment. Basically, that is the formal accusation that the president should be removed from office for these specific reasons. Now, once the House draws up the articles of impeachment and they list the offenses that the president has committed, they have to vote. If the articles are passed by a majority vote, that means the House is accusing the president of committing these offenses. Then the articles move on to the Senate. So the impeachment process shifts from the House, moving over to the Senate. The Senate is where the actual trial of the president would occur. So when the trial happens, the Supreme Court Justice presides over that trial. So in this case, our current Supreme Court Justice will be John Roberts. He would preside over the trial of the president in the Senate. Now, after the trial, the Senate has to vote with a 2/3 majority to remove the president from office. So in the House, they just have to have a simple majority vote, over 50%, in order to approve the articles of impeachment and move the trial or initiate the trial to begin in the Senate. But in the Senate, after the trial is over, they have to have a 2/3 majority vote in order to remove the president from office. So just keep in mind that a few presidents have experienced impeachment to some degree or another. So Andrew Johnson in 1868, his case was interesting. He would be A. His case was interesting because the House actually drew up the articles and they voted on the articles and they got a majority vote. And then when the trial happened in the Senate, after the trial, the Senate voted and they were actually one vote short of voting Jackson out of office for impeachment, to impeach him. So he survived the vote and he was not removed from office, but he did go through the entire process. Another important president that you may have heard of in terms of impeachment is President Nixon, 1974. So because of the Watergate scandal, which was his attempt to influence the presidential nomination process, and then the cover-up that happened after that, basically, President Nixon, in his case, the House did draw up the articles of impeachment. They did vote. They did get a majority vote. However, they drew up the articles of impeachment, but because the word was that they would have a majority to vote him out of office, he resigned before the House could actually vote. So it never even needed to move to the Senate. And then for the third impeached president, we have President Clinton in 1998. After or as a result of the Whitewater investigation, which was seen as something separate, but he was accused of lying under oath during that investigation. So articles of impeachment were drawn up. The House did get a majority vote to impeach President Clinton. However, the Senate did not have enough votes to remove Clinton from office. So he also survived the impeachment process. So it has been done. It has been initiated and moved through various phases. And so that's something to keep in mind. So moving on to think about succession and disability. So the idea of succession is in order to provide a sense of stability and continuity in case anything does happen to the president. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the president, it could be that the president is killed, but also if the president falls ill or for any reason just can't fulfill their duties, then this process of succession would be initiated. So first, it's important to understand that the vice president, we all know the vice president is kind of second in line. And so if anything happened to the president or if the president couldn't fulfill their duties, the vice president is expected to step in. After the vice president, if for some reason anything happened to the vice president, it would be the Speaker of the House, and then the President pro tempore of the Senate, and next in line would be the Secretary of State. Now there's an entire line of succession that follows after that, but what's important to know about succession is that the 25th Amendment actually changes the reality of what succession would look like, because what it says is that the vice president will become president if anything happens to the current president, if they're disabled or if they can't perform their duties. Then the new president has the authority to fill any vacancy in office. Basically, they have the authority to find themselves a new vice president. So the line of succession would not need to continue past the vice president, because the 25th Amendment says the vice president can step into the role of president, and then they can appoint a new vice president, and then succession would be filled. So thinking about the vice presidency, important to understand that they have two main duties that are outlined for them. In addition to everything else they may do, the Constitution outlines two duties. First is to be president of the Senate, and that is especially important in cases of a tie. They're only allowed to vote in order to break a tie. And then second, what we just talked about. The Constitution outlines the necessity for the vice president to become president if the office becomes vacant. So that's not to say that the vice president doesn't have other duties. They do. But as far as what the Constitution outlines, these two are key. Now, thinking about the powers of the president, there are several. I'll go through them until we get to about 14 minutes, 30 seconds, and then I'll move on to the next video and continue. So first, power of the president is the power of being what we would call chief diplomat, and that means president gets to work to maintain relationships with foreign countries and their representatives. So the president represents the United States in these dealings with foreign countries. They have broad authority to conduct foreign relations in order to try and maintain the best interests of the United States. So they have the power, and within this context of being chief diplomat, they have the power to negotiate treaties with foreign countries. However, those treaties have to be ratified by the Senate by a 2/3 majority vote. So the president can negotiate the treaty, but the Senate has to essentially confirm that they do support the treaty as well, and a 2/3 majority vote is significant. Another way, though, that the president can serve as chief diplomat is they can engage in creating executive agreements with foreign powers, and this is a way to kind of draft an international understanding between the president and a foreign nation, but it does not require the Senate to ratify it. So it's kind of an end run around the Senate, and it's a way for the president to conduct foreign relations without waiting to get Senate approval. Second presidential power is commander-in-chief, a term which we've probably heard of before. Basically, this is referring to the fact that the president must always be a civilian, and the United States government always puts a civilian in charge of the United States military. So it's actually a principle called civilian supremacy. But this means that the president has the power to decide on whether to use military force or not, what kind of strategies to use in any kind of military operation, and also they have the authority to select military personnel. So these are some of the duties that would fall under the role of commander-in-chief. Now, this principle of civilian supremacy really is meant to make sure it's not an accident that a civilian is in charge of the military instead of it being the other way around. So that it's a doctrine that requires that the armed forces always have to be under control of civilians, which is different from some other countries where the military actually rules the country and civilians are kind of under the authority of the military. So this principle of civilian supremacy is what creates the opportunity for the president to be, number one, to be a civilian. Even if they were formerly in the military, they must be a civilian at the time that they run for president, and then that civilian is put in charge of our military. And then finally, before I pause and go to a new video, the president also has the advice. They have access to the Joint Chiefs, who are the top military commanders of all of the branches of the military, and they do help keep the president informed and provide advice. So even though the president is a civilian, they have access to advice from the experts in all branches of the military. So I'll be back with video number 2 so we can continue presidential powers.